أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. For the hastening and the return of our beloved 12th Imam, another loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. I hope everyone is doing well, inshallah. And we will continue with the tafsir of Surah Insan. This is inshallah our 5th session on the surah, and we ended in the last session on verse number 8. Well, I should say verse 8 to 10 essentially. And this is where we were going through that famous story of the Ahlul Bayt that is narrated by Shia and by Sunni, that the family of the Prophet, that Ali ibn Abi Talib and his household, they fasted for 3 days, and each of these 3 days, Yatiman, Miskinan, wa Yatiman, wa Asira came and knocked on their doors, and they gave away from their own food. And we talked about this. We emphasized some of the details in this story. The first point that we emphasized was that the Ahlul Bayt were giving food to Miskin and Yatim and Asir. And these are individuals, particularly the last one, Al-Asir, that other individuals may not be willing to give to. Other individuals might hold back when it comes to these individuals. A miskin and a yatim, they are individuals that naturally you feel sympathy towards them. You want to feel kindness towards them. You want to give to them. But the third category, al-asir, a captive, is someone that you may not be able to sympathize with too much. Whereas you find the Ahlul Bayt, each night a different person came to their door, and every single night they gave from their food. This was one point. The second point that we emphasized is that the reason why the Ahlul Bayt are given this high status, because they are valued, the reason why they're valued to this point is because they are giving not just to those who they know. They're not just giving to their friends and their relatives. They also give to people who they may not know at all. You kind of see the context of the story. It seems as though this miskin, this yatim, this asir, they were strangers. And this is why you find in all three of them, there is tanween on all three. Miskinan, a miskin, a poor person. Wa yatiman, and an orphan. Right? Wa asiran, and a captive. Well, we don't know who they were exactly. It seems as though they had no connection with the Ahlul Bayt. It seems as though they weren't necessarily followers of the Ahlul Bayt, and beyond that, they weren't necessarily individuals that were related to the Ahlul Bayt either. It seems as though the Ahlul Bayt were giving also to those who they are not related to. And we said that this is something that we, unfortunately, an element that we find we are losing today in our communities, where we put together gatherings for the Ahlul Bayt, or in the name of the Ahlul Bayt. We put together gatherings within our centers or at homes. More times I see this happening. Private gatherings we put together. And our idea and our thoughts is that we are going to feed the servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the end of the day, we find that we are spending this huge budget only on those who have enough to eat themselves. And when it comes to those who don't have anything to eat, then all of a sudden we don't have a budget for that. And for those who remember talking about this, remember us touching on this, I won't go into too much detail. We've already discussed this. But what the one thing I did say is that when it comes to our own food, if we are to have gatherings like this, whether they're religious or non-religious, the best thing to do is to allocate a separate portion, allocate a separate budget for us to feed those who do not have the money, who do not have the wealth, who do not have the opportunity to feed themselves. Sometimes you might be a situation where you can have them come and sit with you, maybe in a center that is something that is more feasible. Maybe if it's a private gathering, that may not be possible, because of the logistics of how these gatherings take place today. That's fine. At least you have a separate budget for those who are less fortunate and who cannot feed themselves. And if that means taking a little bit away from your own food, from your own lifestyle, then let it be. It's okay for you to have a little bit of a simpler meal and gathering, and instead have a gathering where there are other individuals who may not be part of this gathering in particular, but at least the money goes to them and they can, inshallah, take care of their own needs. And this is very, very key and very important. The problem we are having today is now these gatherings, and when I say these gatherings, I'm including religious gatherings in them. Nowadays, sometimes they have turned into a means of boasting. Sometimes they have turned into a means of comparison, where you're trying to outdo the other person. Yes, this person had this many people at their house. They gave this type of food. This time when we have people over, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. Gatherings that are in the name of the Ahlul Bayt at times, you find this spirit starts to creep into these gatherings. And inshallah, that's another point and another topic that, as I've mentioned before, I've already set this topic aside for us to discuss the things that plague family gatherings, the things that plague and create problems and corrupt our family gatherings. What are those things? The type of things that we say about one another, the way we interact with our relatives within these family gatherings, the way we try to outdo others when it comes to these family gatherings. These are a topic that we will discuss later on. We reach this point in the verses. The Quran said, and these verses of the Quran, if you are familiar, scholars will quote these verses of the Quran to say that the Ahlul Bayt not only gave to miskinan wa yatiman wa asira, beyond that, what they also did is they gave it only for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Meaning that when they were giving this charity, it wasn't that they wanted heaven from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It wasn't that they were fearful of the hellfire. They did this liwajhillah. They did this only to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Only because they find Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala worthy of worship. Okay, so when it comes to those three different levels of worship, many of us have heard this, the categorization, which we'll go through in just a second. These verses of the Quran are quoted a lot of times to say Ahlul Bayt were amongst that group who, when they would do things, they would do it to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. They wouldn't necessarily do it in order to stay away from hellfire. They wouldn't do it necessarily to have their place in heaven either. Okay. When you look at the verses, however, it's very, very interesting, because the verses one time before and one time after, they speak about how the Ahlul Bayt in fact fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If the verses of the Quran are saying that the Ahlul Bayt fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, how does that go hand in hand with them doing things not out of fear, but out of the fact that they just want to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? How does that work? When you go to a hadith, they have categorized our worship into three main categories. A famous hadith that many of us have heard before. And the hadith goes something like this. Ana Abi Abdullah alayhi salam, the sixth Imam, قال إن العباد ثلاثة. He said those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they fall under three different categories. قوم عبد الله عز وجل خوفا. Some who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of fear. فتلك عبادة العبيد. That is the worship of the slaves. A slave will do something simply because he is afraid of his master. He's saying if someone does it like this, they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of fear, meaning fear of the hellfire, then this person, he is worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala like the worshiping of the slaves. Then he moves on to number two. He says, وَقَوْمٌ عَبَدُوا اللَّهَ تَبَارَكَ وَتَعَالَى طَلَبَ الثَّوَابَ. Those who worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the hopes of getting their foot into heaven. فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَةُ الْأَجْرَاءِ, or فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَةُ التُّجَّارِ. This is the worship of the businessman. A businessman says, you know what, this is a good investment. This makes sense for me. I should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala not because He's worthy of worship, not because I love Him, but because I get something out of it. And this second category, and many of us fall under this category, is something that atheists and those who don't believe in God, one of the main objections that they have to the morality that we have in religion is this issue. And we'll come back to this later. That they say, listen, this is in fact very selfish of you. You only do good things because you feel like there's a heaven where you will be rewarded. That's very selfish. And they will follow it up with this. I only do good things because it's the right thing to do. So we'll have to get into that in just a second. But nonetheless, this is the second group. They worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of the hope of entering heaven. And then he says, there is a third group. وَقَوْمٌ عَبَدُوا اللَّهَ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ حُبًّا لَهُ. There's a third group. They worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of the love that they have for Him. فَتِلْكَ عِبَادَةُ الْأَحْرَارِ وَهِيَ أَفْضَلُ الْعِبَادَةِ. That is the worship of those who are free, and that is the best form of worship. These three categories. Naturally, when we speak about the Ahlul Bayt, where are we going to place them in these three categories? None of us is going to say they fall under Ibadatul Abid. They worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of fear. We're not going to put them in that category. We're going to put them in the best category, yes? We're not going to say they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because they look at it as a business transaction. We're going to say they worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala out of their love. And this is what we have been taught. But when you look at these verses that we just went through, 2 times they speak about their fear of the day of judgment. See, in these verses, verse 8 onwards starts out, it says, وَيُطْعِمُونَ الطَّعَامَ عَلَى حُبِّهِ مِسْكِينًا وَيَتِيمًا وَأَسِيرًا. Then when you move on, it says, number 10, إِنَّا نَخَافُ مِن رَبِّنَا يَوْمًا عَبُوسًا قَمْطَرِيرًا. Say, we are fearful of that day in which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will hold everyone accountable. And before verse number 8, they also mentioned this. If you go back and you look at verse number, it's verse number 7, يُوفُونَ بِالنَّذْرِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, they are the ones who hold on to their promises. They fulfill their nadhr. وَيَخَافُونَ يَوْمًا كَانَ شَرُّهُ مُسْتَطِيرًا. So one time before, one time after, verse 7, verse 10, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, these servants of mine who are the special servants, yes, this is the Ahlul Bayt that the Quran is talking about. These servants of mine, they are fearful of me, and they are fearful of the day of judgment. And then in the middle it says, إِنَّمَا نُطْعِمُكُمْ لِوَجْهِ اللَّهِ. We only feed you all, we only give to you all out of seeking the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So which one is it finally? Which one is it? Are you doing this because you're fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or are you doing this because you want to please Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Please Him in the sense that you're doing it out of His love. Which one is it? Because we are always taught that the Ahlul Bayt, they do things out of their love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet the verses of the Quran, 2 times as I mentioned, say that this group of people who we know are the Ahlul Bayt, they are fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So how does this work? There seems to be a little bit of a contradiction here. And the answer to this question, and this is a gateway into an important understanding as it relates to our religion. The understanding here is this, that your fear of the day of judgment and you doing things out of your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are not contradicting one another. They are compatible with one another. It is possible for you to fear the day of judgment as much as the Ahlul Bayt do, which the Quran describes for us, and at the same time for you to do things out of your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. These two do not contradict one another. You can fear the day of judgment, but at the same time, because of your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is the case with the Ahlul Bayt. And what is this explaining to us? What is this teaching us, brothers and sisters? It is teaching us this, that if someone really wants to reach that point where they do things for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that's not where we start. You start at a lower stage. At this lower stage, you do things because of your fear of the hellfire. You do things because of your love for heaven. That's how things start out. But as your faith continues to grow, as you become a better person, then slowly the human being starts to graduate from this stage. And now reaches a state where now he is doing things for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala while he still fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what is this teaching us? This is teaching us that those who are at the highest levels of spirituality, and this has a very, very important implication that I'm going to come back to. Those who are at the highest levels of spirituality from our perspective, who are no one but the Ahlul Bayt, they also fear the day of judgment. Fearing the day of judgment is part of your faith no matter how much you grow. See, normally the way we speak about this concept is this, that yes, if your understanding of religion is a superficial understanding of religion, then yes, you'll be afraid of the day of judgment, you'll be fearful of that day, and I'll explain what we mean of being fearful of that day in just a second. But usually we speak of this as a superficial level of understanding of religion. That yes, once you grow spiritually, no, the fear of the day of judgment and all this stuff, this goes out of the window. After that, it's all love and it's all spirituality and it's all you and God. And whereas the reality is the Ahlul Bayt, at the highest levels, they still have this fear. Now, what does this fear mean? Does it mean that they fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the sense that they're worried God is going to punish them? No, that's not the fear. The fear that builds in your heart for those who have grown, like the Ahlul Bayt, like the prophets, it is a fear that comes from just understanding the essence of the Day of Judgment and understanding the power and the authority of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If I want to give you an analogy, if I wanted to put this in simpler terms, it kind of looks and sounds like this, that you might come across something where you are not going to be threatened by. But just because you understand how severe that situation is, in your heart, you have a fear in your heart. You understand how formidable that situation is. Let's say, for example, you might be walking somewhere, and there might be a cliff, and you're not even close to the cliff. But just when you look at the cliff, what happens, of course, this is just an example. This is just an example. This is not a complete description. It's just an example. Trying to use an analogy here. When you come upon this cliff, even though you know you're not going to fall, just when you look upon this cliff, right? Imagine you're standing in front of the Grand Canyon. Just the moment you see the Grand Canyon, your heart sinks a little bit, doesn't it? Because you think to yourself that if I were to ever fall, even though you're not, you know you're not going to, but you just think to yourself, if I were to ever fall, how much of a fall it would be. Just the greatness of what is standing in front of you, it makes your heart sink. That is an analogy for a little bit of what we understand from the fear that the Ahlul Bayt have of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the Day of Judgment. It's not a fear that yes, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish us. It's more a fear of them understanding His greatness. You know the panicking that you feel when you're about to meet someone who is really, really great? Not because you're worried that this great person is going to punish you, not because you're worried he'll take away your money, your family. You're not worried about any of those things. But if you were to meet the president of any country, yes, the king of any country, the queen of any country, before you, I don't care who you are, before you enter, you're going to be sweating. Now then take that and multiply it by infinity, and that's what you have with God. And that's why we read that when the Ahlul Bayt used to come and speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, forget about punishment for a second, forget about the Day of Judgment for a second. When they wanted to come and speak to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Hadith says that Ali ibn al-Hussein, the fourth Imam, when he used to come and prepare for Salat, he would go pale. And they used to ask him, they say, Ya ibn Rasulullah, why is it that you're changing so much? And he used to say, because if you understood who I am going to stand in front of, you would have also had a change in your behavior just like me. You would have changed in those moments when you're going to stand in front of him. It's very different. Now when Ali ibn al-Hussein, the fourth Imam, stands in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and he is speaking to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is he fearful that God is going to punish him? No, he's not doing anything wrong. He's going to pray to him. This is a different type of fear, one that might be a little bit difficult for us to relate to it because we're not at that level. We are fearful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, usually because we've messed up somewhere. We've done something wrong. And we are fearful of the consequences. The fear that the Ahlul Bayt have comes from somewhere else. But nonetheless, the more you grow spiritually, the more your fear in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grows in this sense. And if this is misunderstood, it becomes a major problem in your relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I want to make sure we get this right. The reason why your fear grows, the better of a person you become, is not because you have bad deeds. It's because you understand who God is, you understand His greatness more. So of course you're going to sweat when you come into His presence. Of course you're going to feel that His presence is a formidable presence. It is a presence that when people want to come into it, when people pay attention to it, when people speak to this presence, they will feel a fear. They will feel a smallness, a humility, a humbleness inside of themselves because of the greatness that they are standing in front of. So the more you grow spiritually, the more the formidability of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grows in your heart. And so sometimes we speak about religion and we say, yes, this fear of the Day of Judgment, and this is not important. This is not something you should be bothering yourself with too much. This is people trying to make religion difficult. No, the Ahlul Bayt are saying, إِنَّا نَخَافُ مِن رَبِّنَا يَوْمًا عَبُوسًا قَمْطَرِيرًا. Ahlul Bayt are saying this, who are at the highest levels of spirituality. The more you become spiritual, the more you will sweat it when you want to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not necessarily because you have these terrible deeds that He's going to punish you for. No, the more you do good, of course, the least that's going to happen. The more you become better, it's because the more deeper your understanding becomes of who this person is or this entity is that you are standing in front of. And therefore, the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the doing things for the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, these two are completely compatible with one another. The Ahlul Bayt feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and at the same time, because they had graduated from that level, they used to do things not out of that fear, they used to do things out of their love, they used to do things out of the worthiness that they found in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be worshipped. Okay, moving on from this point, I hope I was able to get the point across because this is a delicate point that we are discussing here. Moving on from this, you'll come across atheists who will raise this objection. Recite a salawat, please. Moving on beyond this, you will come across atheists who will raise this objection. They will say, listen, you all are moral. You say that you need religion to be moral individuals. And of course, we don't necessarily agree on that, but we say you have a sense of morality in your religion. Here's their objection. Their objection is this. They say, listen, you guys are only moral because of selfish reasons. What do you mean by that? He says, listen, you're only moral because there was someone to tell you and you believed what they told you, that if you do this moral deed or if you do that good deed or this good deed, that there's some sort of reward waiting for you. There's this heaven waiting for you, which we will actually, coincidentally, we will be discussing in detail today, the description that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives of heaven in the Quran. So we're about to go into that coincidentally. But he says, listen, you're only moral because of a selfish sense inside of yourself. And that is because you're only moral because you feel like there's some reward for you. If you didn't have that sense of there being a reward, if they were to take away this heaven from you, would you still be just as moral? Would you still do the right thing? Or do you only do the right thing because you were told that you will go into this garden where you can drink anything you want, you can eat anything you want, you can socialize with whoever you want? It seems as though that's the reason for your morality. And this is actually a serious objection, that you all are actually selfish in your morality. Okay, so how do we think about this? How do we go about this? Well, the reality is, yes, initially the human being, he might do things out of this sense of knowing that there's a reward, or might stay away from certain things that are immoral because he knows that if he does this immoral thing, there will be a punishment for him. But this was not the goal of religion. The goal of religion was to take the human being from this point and have him graduate to a point where he does things out of his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Not out of love for heaven or fear of hellfire. This is the graduation that the human being is supposed to go through. Yes, initially when we start out, this is where we start out from. I do a good deed because there's a reward for it. I stay away from haram things or immoral things because I feel like there's a punishment for it. But this is not where I'm supposed to stay. And many of us, in fact, stay here, by the way. Many of us, when Ramadan, for example, comes up, we're so worried about playing math with God that constantly we're thinking, okay, how many good deeds will I get if I do this dua? How many good deeds will I get if I do that dua? Less thinking about building a relationship with Him Himself. We're not worried about that. We're more worried about, oh, this dua has 70 hasanat, but this one has 80. So let me actually do this, right? So that is an issue that we have. But the human being was supposed to start from here initially and then slowly grow spiritually. Well, now he does things out of his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And not simply because there is a day of judgment and not because there is a hellfire. Though he might know those things, like the Ahlul Bayt knew those things and acknowledged those things, they didn't do things out of the fear of hellfire or out of their love for heaven or their hope for heaven. So this objection might be there, but this is not where religion wanted us to stop. This was just the first step. Just like when your child is growing up and you want them to, for example, read Quran or memorize Quran or do their salat, maybe initially you will give them some incentives here and there, yes? You will ask them that if this Ramadan, for example, they listen to all the lectures and they answer all the questions of the quiz, that you have a prize for them. That's an incentive there. But your hope is that this child will not grow and reach a level of maturity that after a while he will say, you know what, I'll do these things because of those things themselves. Not necessarily if there is an incentive or there isn't, even though I know that the incentive will still be there because my parents will be happy with me and all of that, but essentially he won't be doing things for that reason anymore. That is the hope. And so the human being, just like this child that needs an incentive initially, and then after that understands the importance of what he's doing, similarly the human being starts at this level, and then slowly he starts to graduate to a point where doing good things now becomes part of who he is. He does them out of his love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He does them not necessarily to stay away from hellfire or to enter into heaven, but this is the goal that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in mind for the human being. Initially, that's not where the human being starts out from. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum. Okay, moving on from here, moving on from verse number 10. Verse number 10 said that we fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We fear our Lord and our nurturer. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala now is going to speak as it relates to them. They fear Him. What does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do in return? فَوَقَاهُمُ اللَّهُ شَرَّ ذَلِكَ الْيَوْمِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protected them from the evil of that day. What's the evil of that day? The evil that the human beings themselves will create with their own actions. The evil doesn't come from God. No evil can come from God. This is a philosophical discussion. This is the evil that the human beings have created themselves. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we will protect them from the evil of that day because they feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they didn't commit any sins for there to be any consequences for it. وَلَقَّاهُمْ نَظْرَةً وَسُرُورًا. And instead, when we see them on that day, we meet them with happiness and with joy. Just imagine, brothers and sisters, and try to put this into perspective. Imagine walking into the day of judgment. Imagine walking into mahshar. And you come across individuals. Now the verse here is talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we know that on the day of judgment, the Ahlul Bayt will be seen as well. The Prophet in particular, Shia and Sunni agree that he will be seen on that day. Imagine walking onto the day of judgment. And out of this life that you've lived 60, 70, 80 years, imagine just walking into the day of judgment. And when you walk into the day of judgment and you see the Prophet standing there, imagine that he smiles at you because of the fact that you made him proud because of everything that you did in this world. Imagine the sweetness of that moment. Imagine how wonderful of a feeling it is. That is a moment that one might argue is worth everything you did in your life. It's worth it as a reward for everything that you did in your life. That you walk into the day of judgment and the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt look upon you and they smiled at you. وَلَقَاهُمْ نَضْرَةً وَسُرُورًا. Imagine the sweetness of that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying, these servants of ours, when they come into the day of judgment, that's how we will meet them. That when they come after having gone through all the difficulties and all the sacrifices and everything that they've gone through, now they come, we meet them with happiness. Imagine the sweetness of that moment. And this is why it's mentioned in hadith about Ibrahim alayhi salam. That Ibrahim, we know, he had a number of inquiries that he made of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. One of them was that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would show him how he resurrects the human being. كَيْفَ تُحْيَى الْمَوْتَى. He asked Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to show him how he does that. And in the famous story, he told him to take birds and place them on different, corners of or on the different peaks of the mountains or the hills and call them and they will come back, as we read in the famous story. Another inquiry that Ibrahim did was that he asked Malakul Maut to show him what it's like to leave this world. And Malakul Maut told him, listen, you won't be able to bear it, forget about it. And Ibrahim insisted. And Malakul Maut then said, fine, if this is something you're insisting, though you may not be able to take it, I will show it to you as it relates to how it is when we come to take the life of a person. He said, though it depends whether this person is a good person or a bad person. He said, okay, fine. He said, okay, turn away from me. And Ibrahim turns away from him. And then he says, okay, turn back. And the moment he turns back, and now Malakul Maut is showing what it looks like when he comes to take the life of a wrongdoer. And the narration describes this moment where Ibrahim looked upon Malakul Maut. And the face that he had and the appearance that he had was so scary and frightening that he fainted. In that there was a terrible smell and that there was fire everywhere. He said he fainted. Then when he came back again, he said, turn around, this time I will show you, and this is the point that I brought up this hadith, this time turn around and I will show you what it's like if I come to take the life of a believer, of a good person. I'll show you what it looks like. And he told him to turn around, and he turned around, and then he told him to look back. And when he looks back, Ibrahim sees the face of a young person who smells wonderful and is so beautiful, the scene is so beautiful for him that in that moment he faints again. And then when he comes back, Ibrahim says this. He says, Ya Malakul Maut, the moment I saw your face, the terrible face that you had, the scary, frightening face that you had, that moment, just the feelings and the experience and the emotions that I had in that one moment, if that was the only punishment that a wrongdoer would see in this world, it would have been equal to what he has done. It's enough of a punishment. And then he says this. He says, what I saw, the appearance of yours that I saw, when you come to take the life of a believer, just that first moment when you appear in his presence, what I saw of you in that moment, if a believer gets no reward and the only thing that he gets in return is seeing you in that particular situation, it is worth it as a reward for everything that he has done in this world. If he just sees that. And this kind of gives you the same feeling, because when someone enters into the day of judgment, just imagine entering into the day of judgment and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is happy with you. The feeling that you have when you experience this, the sweetness that it carries with it, is beyond anything that we have experienced in this world. A little sense of that, brothers and sisters, is when you achieve something really, really great in your life, a dream that you had or your parents had for you, and then, for example, you see your father, or for example, you see your mother, and they see that you have been able to accomplish your goals in life. The sweetness that you feel in that moment when they look upon you, they smile at you, and they are proud of you, which is so difficult for us to bear in the sense that it's such an overwhelming, wonderful experience. A lot of times you'll see that when someone comes up on stage, everyone is cheering for him. Yes, everyone is shouting their names. You see this with celebrities at times. Everyone is shouting their names. Everyone is happy for them. But the one thing that usually makes them cry, the one point that really hits home with them, the one thing that makes them, makes their tears start to leave their eyes is what? Is if they see their parents in the crowd. Because when they see their parents in the crowd and their parents are looking upon them with pride, that is a feeling that no one else can give to them. No one else being pleased with them can give them that feeling. And this is why we read in Dua Kumail that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or Ali ibn Abi Talib says, as it relates to his relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what does he say? He says, if I would be able to take the punishment of hellfire, habni sabartu ala harri narik, فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك. How would I be able to take the idea knowing that you could have been pleased with me, but you're not pleased with me? حبني صبرت على حر نارك فكيف أصبر على فراقك. Maybe I'd be able to take the punishment of hellfire, but how would I be able to take the fact that now I am distanced from you? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse of the Quran is flipping it. وَلَقَّاهُمْ نَظْرَةً وَسُرُورًا. When they come on the day of judgment, the sweetness that they feel when they see how pleased we are with them. This is the most important thing. This is why the verses of the Quran say that on that day there are those رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُمْ وَرَضُوا عَنْهُ. There are those that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them and they are pleased with Him. This relationship goes beyond just heaven and hell. It's a next level. It's a higher blessing of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fact that you know that your Creator is pleased with you. If you want a sense of that, think about how you would feel if you saw a mentor of yours, a father of yours, after 50, 60 years of working hard for you, sacrificing for you, in one moment they look upon you and they smile upon you. Now take that moment and now extend it. This is the pleasure in heaven. It's not just the physical pleasures, which we will go through in just a second. It's also these spiritual pleasures as well. Recite a salawat, please. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. وجزاهم, moving on from that, verse number 12. وجزاهم بما صبروا جنة وحريرا. And because of everything that they had done, we are now going to reward them with jannatan, with this garden, this heaven, which the Quran is going to describe, وحريرا, and clothing that is made of silk. Okay. Now, before we go into the description that the Quran is now going to make of heaven, inshallah, I don't think we'll have time to go into that. The first question that we need to ask is this. The Quran here says, وَجَزَاهُمْ بِمَا صَبَرُوا, and we will reward them for all of the things that they had patience for. We would have assumed that the Quran would say, we will reward them for everything that they did. And yet you see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is switching this word with what? We will reward them for all the patience that they had. What is the Quran trying to clarify and explain to us by switching these two words? It's a question to think about for next week. وَجَزَاهُمْ بِمَا صَبَرُوا. We are going to reward them for all of their patience. Why wouldn't you say we're going to reward them for everything they did? What's the relationship between everything they did and the patience that they had? What are the different types of patience, and how much does this patience affect my life in the next world, and how much does it affect my life in this world? If I'm a youth of 10-year-old, 12-year-old, 15-year-old, 20-year-old, how does this concept of patience affect my life right now and right here? It's a very, very important point that we need to get across, inshallah, and we need to convey. The importance of patience in life and how critical that is to your growth in the next world, to your success in the next world, as well as your growth here in the professional world, as well as the personal aspect of your life. Both when it comes to your career, how important is patience? We're going to talk about that. As it relates to your personal life, how important is it? And as it relates to the hereafter, in our life in the hereafter, what is the importance of patience that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this verse, instead of saying we're going to reward them for everything they did, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we're going to reward them for all the patience that they had, for all the patience that they implied or applied to their life. What's the relationship between these two? Inshallah, that we will leave for our next session. I was planning to cover a lot more, but some of the points we made required some more explanation, so I just had to go through those. Before we end, inshallah, let's take a moment to recite Surah Fatiha for all of our marhumin and marhumat, and all marhumin and marhumat of all of the believers anywhere in the world, with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين.